I just finished the new Hillsong Secrets Episode 1 from FX, and let me tell you, it was not what I was expecting, in both good and bad ways. Here's what I mean. Now, if you don't know, a bit of background information, earlier last year, Discovery Plus did a docuseries on the exact same topic, and it was actually the first video to kick off this YouTube channel. It covered a majority of the big scandals surrounding Hillsong, like Brian Houston, his dad, all the hush money stuff, and where was it going, and even Carl Lentz's moral failings. But where these two series overlapped, I'll just encourage you to go check out this video instead of repeating myself over and over again. Link to that will be at the end of the video and in the description below. But with it barely being a year since the last documentary, one might ask, FX, why do we need another documentary? And the answer to that is simple: money. But also, the marketing for the Secrets of Hillsong kept showcasing and putting front and center Carl Lentz and having interview footage with him directly addressing the controversies surrounding himself and Hillsong. I mean, I don't think this is me getting the wrong impression, because the literal thumbnail for the trailer on YouTube and the posters have him and only him in them. So it was a surprise to me that through the whole first episode, we don't actually get any footage of him except at the tail end of the episode. But we'll get to that in a minute. Instead, what we get in the first hour of the series is a lot of the same information and personal experiences of both those who were a part of Hillsong NYC and those reporters that were called to cover all the Hillsong drama. While it covers a lot of the same beats as Hillsong Exposed, this one did seem to find people who are a bit more involved, people who might even, I dare say, care more deeply about the church, or at least they did, about all of this that happened, such as key volunteer leaders of the NYC campus who had been around for years with the church. So I did appreciate that, but in following with the Hillsong Exposed, they understand that everybody loves to see the dirty mess and drama, and so the Secrets of Hillsong goes above and beyond in this hour to make Hillsong seem like a evil corporation, and Brian Houston and Carl Lentz, these evil cult leaders, at the top of it all, putting all of their evil practices in place. And maybe like me, after you watched it, you might have stopped and thought,
wait a minute, my church has said similar things. My church has asked for money and for me to volunteer. Is that as wrong as this series making it out to be?
Well, let's break it down and talk about it. Now, understand, I've been reporting and talking about all the drama that has come out of Hillsong and how Christians should be responding to it years before either of these series ever came out. And I feel the weight and pain personally as a pastor. My heart breaks for the way their sin and mishandling of these situations have caused others to lose trust in not just the church, but God himself. It makes me sick, and I'll be the first one to call out Hillsong on weird, confusing, and just flat out wrong practices. But this series really goes out of its way to take jabs not just at Hillsong, but Christianity as a whole. You see, when I first saw this series, I thought it might be a counterbalance to the Hillsong Exposed series. Not in that it would be defending Christianity or Hillsong. Not in my wildest dreams would I think a network like FX would do something like that, but instead be giving another perspective from Carl Lentz and those that had a different experience with the NYC campus, and almost pit against the mothership in Australia with this NYC campus. And maybe that's still coming up in the next few episodes, but this one starts off by basically being a hit piece against Carl Lentz, which again just seems weird since the whole marketing was presented as his side finally allowing to be able to speak the truth. And they basically just rip into him again with these same stories that have been a part of the news for literally years now about him and the NYC campus. And some of it I see as fair and needed to establish who he is and what the culture at Hillsong NYC was like, but other parts of it just go a little wild and was framed in a weird way that was more meant for entertainment than accurate reporting. For example, they talk about Hillsong's growth and desire to expand and keep up with the demands for more services and thus the need to ask for more resources to do so from their congregant. And one of the interviewees brings up a great point that it's not wrong to want to grow because that means they are living out the mission and reaching more people with the gospel. That's a good thing. And she actually points out how the real issue then lies not in asking for money or expanding or any of that stuff, but in losing the focus and being obsessed instead with fame and fortune, which I think is a great observation and a great subject to look into biblically. How do we keep our eyes fixed on the mission? What could they have done to better protect themselves from it? But no, instead of ever addressing that, this is not drama-filled enough. Instead, it cuts right back to trying to make Hillsong look like the Dharma Initiative, just trying to get their brand everywhere and on every theme, and uses the idea of their songwriting and music and other expansions as an evil world dominating plan, making it seem like the church was all about abusing their volunteers and sucking their attendees dry financially to fill their own pockets and protect their bottom line. And it was at this point that I realized that this documentary was clearly not made for me or other Christians or people people who want to have a better understanding of the inner workings of a church, but rather for the skeptic and those who just love drama, regardless on if it's factual or even reasonable or not. Because the truth is, every church needs money to be able to operate and run. That's no secret. And churches need to be responsible with the resources that they get and be good stewards with those things. I break it down in this video here, that subject, and if you should be giving to a church and if you should be paying pastors. So if you're interested in that topic, go ahead and check that video out. I'll make sure to link it at the end. But for the sake of time, I won't break it all down here. Instead, just know that in a very real way, churches have to operate like a business, which in the documentary made it seem like this is a horrible, nasty thing.
Like, how could a church ever think about money? That's so greedy.
Now, when I say every church has to function on some level like a business, here's what I mean when I say that. They need to have a budget. They have to prioritize some things over another. A broken water pipe in the auditorium that would cancel a Sunday morning service is more important than a new microphone or a new light. Another example of this is figuring out how much they can reasonably send to missionaries overseas. Those things have to be thought through faithfully and in prayer. Now, is this what Hillsong was doing? Well, the documentary would like you to believe not, and insinuating that they had millions just funneling at the top for them. Now, I can't say for sure because I wasn't there and I'm not a part of Hillsong. And like I said, this documentary loses some credibility when it tries to make a church having tithing, which every church does, a result of a church turning into a corporate greed practice instead of a biblical call for believers who are faithful. The same could be said for how they frame volunteering. In the series, they try to make it this cult-like forced labor. And it's so insane because at one point, a volunteer in the same breath says that his problem was that he needed a job but was volunteering too much and was mad because the church wouldn't pay him for his volunteer work, literally stating, "What do I get out of this?" Now, I'm not sure if there is a different definition of volunteer the rest of the world is using, but the reality is when I volunteer at church, which I do even though I am an employee of my church, I don't look to see how much they will pay me. Volunteering means I am of my own free will going to do something for free and not expect something in return. Now, in this man's case, if he can't afford to volunteer and needs a job, that's on him to communicate that and pull back from volunteering. That's not on a church to pay him or create a job for him. It would be great and I'm sure appreciated for a church to help in one of those ways, but shouldn't be expected. This seems like common sense, but the documentary tries to make you believe otherwise. Another big part of this first episode was how Hillsong pretended to be this different, cool, progressive church, and once in was a bait and switch, kind of like this episode so far. With conservative beliefs and practices such as no premarital sex, understanding how God sees family and marriage, things that are found in the Bible. Also tries to tie Christianity and Hillsong into this political right secret agenda to collect and assimilate power. Yeah, like I said, it gets kind of wild here. It really goes out of its way to throw everything at you, from BLM issues and LGBTQ stuff, to make you believe that the real problem is that Christianity is a white man-made religion used to oppress anyone outside of that category, even bringing on a spiritual psychotherapist. What? Again, totally missing the fact that there are a ton of non-white churches, not just in the US, but all over the world. Black churches, Asian churches, Messianic Jewish churches that have rich history here in the US and all around the world. Also, that Christendom was started in a little place in the world where white people were definitely not the majority. But we aren't going to bother talking about any of that stuff in this series. Instead, let's focus on two people, one from each of those agendas I listed before, and have them share their personal hurt from Hillsong's actions. Starting with Josh, and how Hillsong NYC did him dirty, allowing him to sing on the worship team at two different locations until he appeared on Survivor and gained some notoriety as a gay Christian man that sang at Hillsong Church, leading Brian Houston to come out with a public statement on where Hillsong as an organization stood on LGBTQ issues, but not really clear enough on their policies of what they are allowed or not allowed to do within their church walls. Overall, I feel like from Josh's side of the story, while I might not agree with his views, it seems like he handled the situation pretty well, even seeking advice from the leaders at Hillsong NYC before appearing on Survivor and sharing about his church and his faith. And I can understand his frustration as they removed him from an upfront position and still allowed him to remain a part of the vocal team off stage. The lines seem really blurry, and I can totally see Hillsong struggling with their language around these types of topics while trying to appear outwardly as the cool church. That's something Hillsong has always had to manage the tension of, and I think it's, again, just shows us the need for clarity in these types of issues and topics. The only thing I thought that was, again, a bit of a twist is how they try to use the idea of come as you are, part of Hillsong's NYC slogan, to, from Josh's perspective, once you are here, let us change you. Again, I think these two ideas can and should be present at every church. But even going beyond just churches, any gym or counseling center or any place that tries to help you see development in your life will tell you to come as you are. Just come now, get started today. But once you are here, out of love, we have a desire to see you grow. Don't stay the way that you are. Crystal Rose was the other story, a black woman who was a worship leader, paraded around, according to her, to sing and represent Hillsong in the media and at different locations. That is, until, according to her, she started making waves about representation and how other minorities weren't being selected for leadership roles even though they were qualified. And even though she herself was proof of the opposite of that, this led to her one day unknowingly being asked to leave the church and being escorted out. Now, one thing I can give a point or half a point to the makers of this series is once they were done telling a story, they end with these black cards to share a bit of the other side if the people on the other side of these stories were willing to share any comments. And with Crystal, they did, stating that they had tried for weeks to reach out and have a leadership conversation with her, and that she avoided or ignored them leading up to that Sunday morning and the actions that they had to take. As I was listening to her story, being in ministry for well over a decade now, I can understand the reality and problems that lie in these stories, and that the truth is probably somewhere in between the middle of these two. But again, during all this, they try to make Carl Lentz this walking contradiction, literally even calling him that. And again, while yes, he has some moral failing, but I think a bigger part of this whole thing that goes unaddressed, at least in this first episode, is the idea and warning of placing pastors in these celebrity statuses or on these pedestals. And while Carl definitely leaned into this position and didn't help any by making people see him as a normal guy, I have seen in the church world around the world people who do this all the time with their pastors who don't try to be flashy with Gucci belts or anything else. And when we do this, we are putting them in a place that should only be for God. We stop seeing them as regular, normal people and instead see them as these unfallible people who cannot fail or fall into sin. And while this might seem harmless at first, it eventually rocks our faith when these people fail us. But often this aspect doesn't get talked about because it's much easier to just point to someone else and go, it's their fault, it's Carl Lentz's fault for my bad relationship with God, and we use that as an excuse for not doing the real work. When in reality, we see in scripture God calls people like David a man after God's own heart. And God used David in some big ways, and yet in the Bible we see him take his adultery up to 11. And here's my point in sharing that with you, meaning that anyone and everyone can or will fall short of the glory of God. This is why we need Jesus as our Savior. I'm not excusing any of the sin or pain and hurt that Carl caused, but I think it's just as important to check our own hearts and make sure we aren't falling into thinking that we are untouchable or viewing someone else this way, because pride always comes before the fall. And I think this is what we will see more of and be hearing about in this next episode, as it leaves us on this cliffhanger with Lentz sitting down and feeling nervous about the optics of him sitting down to do this interview. And while this documentary wants to make you believe that this is an issue throughout all of Christianity, the reality is there are so many faithful pastors and churches that have served for years and decades faithfully without falling into moral failings, leading their churches well. But those stories won't typically get talked about. Instead, what we often see in the news is what I call pop Christianity. And this is just a taste of it, when it feels just Christian enough, but might be underlying and trying to sell you something else entirely. If you want to learn more on how to identify this and how we should be responding to it as Christians, check out this video right over here where I talk about it and what the effects that it could have on those listening to it. Or right below it, we said are the videos talking about seeing the church as a business. And if you're still skeptical on that, and if you should give your hard-earned money to a pastor, well, check that one out down there. But until next time, guys, know that you are valued and loved, and I'll see you soon.